Welcome to Women Talkin Bout AI, where we have conversations about technology, creativity, and the human side of artificial intelligence. We don't evangelize AI, and we don't reject it either. We examine it critically, curiously, and with a lot of compassion. We do this so that we can all make more informed human choices about how we use it. Or not. Let's get into it.
Today on Women Talkin Bout AI, we're joined by Melanie Dusseau and Miriam Reynoldson, co-authors of the Open Letter from Educators Who Refuse the Call to Adopt Gen AI in Education, which has collected over 1,000 signatures and was featured in an article by Forbes. Melanie is an associate professor of English at the University of Findlay and a writer whose work spans poetry, plays, and fiction. Miriam is a Melbourne-based digital learning designer, educator, and PhD candidate at RMIT University, whose research explores the value of learning in times of digital ubiquity. Together, they've sparked an international conversation about what it means to teach and resist in the midst of a world inclusive of generative AI. Melanie and Miriam, welcome to Women Talking About AI.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Kimberly and I spent a lot of time preparing for this conversation with the two of you. We have a lot that we want to get to, and I'm sure we won't get to. I know that the both of you come from different sides of education. Melanie, you're on the creative writing side, and Miriam, you're on the digital learning design side. But you did find this common cause in AI resistance. So if you could tell us, how do you know each other and what drew each of you to this collaboration?
Okay. Now, as Miriam said earlier, LinkedIn friendship. And I started reading Miriam's Substack. I started noticing that she and I were commenting on similar threads, and we had some friends in common, and that our conversation was starting to center around resistance and refusal, again, from two very different areas, but also centering teaching and the education space. So I just found that we had a lot in common, and we ended up joining forces on other things.
I don't think I don't think I've mentioned this, Melanie, but I actually studied creative writing in my undergraduate. And so I think I graduated towards your voice because it's the kind of voice that I have always wanted. I don't think I've told you that before. It's a bit of a
Thank you.
yes, like that.
I always joke about my poor partner, Anthony, because I to just talk to him about everything. And I read Melanie's essay, Burn It Down, to him out loud yesterday. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh, man, like I really wish I could write like this. I love your voice too. So I can totally
Thank you.
relate to that.
I think that's how Kimberly and I sort of connected on LinkedIn, because you have a satirical vibe in some of your posts, which I completely appreciate. So I think we were admiring each other's sometimes snarkiness,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, but yeah, that I was gonna say I'm in the same camp. I've been sort of, there's like a healthy stalking that can happen with people. Like there's no other word for it, but like I became really fascinated with your voice and you're so creative. And sometimes it's just direct and it's essay like and then other times it's so playful.
Since I already brought up Melanie's essay, I want to just jump to that because there's something in that essay that really stuck with me. Melanie, in it, you said, I'm going to read one of your quotes. If you are tired of the drumbeat of inevitability that insists English faculty adopt AI into our teaching practices, I'm here to tell you that you are allowed to object. Not only are we allowed to say no, we ought to think deeply about the why of that no. So that phrase, the drumbeat of inevitability, reminded me of several books that Kimberly and I have both been reading, like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff and Empire of AI by Karen Howe, both of which argue that technology isn't natural or inevitable, it's intentional and it serves certain interests. So when you talk about that drumbeat of inevitability, like what are you hearing in higher ed culture and what forces are really pushing that story? And how can educators like reclaim their agency in it?
Yeah, that was a really important message I wanted to get across in that views piece, because I think there's faculty having agency is kind of a mixed bag. Some people can very safely resist and refuse AI and be very vocal about it. And I feel very privileged to be in that space where the place where I work doesn't try to silence my views. and others don't have that freedom. That's why I put the word license in it. Like you are allowed to. The why of the objection, I think there's always this laundry list of ethical concerns about this technology, the guardrails, the complete disregard for mental health, especially of young users, the well-documented cases of hallucinations, the whole eco end of it, and people having concerns about the environment. So I think when we look at all of those whys, it started to remind me of the list of concerns for like prescription drugs. AI may cause, and then you have like this big litany of things that people say, oh, wow. And now I'm just supposed to say, now I will proceed with my implementation plan. So I really wanted people to realize that if they were feeling a little weird about it, and having objections that don't have to be my objections, because I think there are so many different little silos of resistance of people resisting for different reasons. It's definitely not a monolith, not even in writing studies or creative writing writ large. It's kind of a mixed bag, and I like that about it. But I think not enough people, judging by the reaction, because I've never written something where random people emailed me afterwards. And that's what I got. I got emails from faculty all over saying, I'm so glad to know that I'm not alone in feeling this way about generative AI. So to me, that was one of the most important things, that it reached that wide of an audience, that people felt that they could just respond to me, that they felt similar concerns about the implementation. And it also helped me branch out, and because a lot of the things I've learned about generative AI are from colleagues and people I've met on LinkedIn and fellow faculty who are implementing. And that the conversation about resistance need not be one where we are judging the people who are implementing AI, especially those of them doing it in very thoughtful ways and intentional ways, but that our disagreement doesn't have to be a heated debate where we're pointing fingers at each other, because I have learned quite a bit about the innovation in pedagogy, which is something I share with implementers who are saying, well, some things need to change, our assessments need to change, our assignments, our approach. And I am firmly in the camp of sort of progressive, always evolving pedagogy. And on that, I think we share a little bit of common ground, that change is good. We just are sort of disagreeing on the direction that generative AI has in that change.
And Miriam, you write a lot about how the digital, or maybe tech and tech implementation, is not separate from human life. And so I'm curious about, I mean, I want to hear you say first a little bit about the post digital, because a lot of your work kind of centers around that word. And so if you could kind of define that for our listeners, what does it mean? And then just to follow on what Melanie was saying, it's like your work seems to ask, okay, what are we saying yes to instead if we do reject or refuse generative AI? So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about those things.
Sure. Well, first, in terms of the post-digital, it's the fundamental understanding, not that the digital is over, the digital has happened and now we're post-digital, but kind of like we're post-apocalyptic. The apocalypse has happened, digital has happened to us, and now we live in the entangled aftermath of that. Basically, I can't go from one place to another in my own life without having my choices and my movements mediated by all manner of digital technologies. That's not a negative value judgment, but purely a descriptive fact of my existence. And to be able to kind of center that in an analysis is to reflect on the ways in which that mediation is happening. So some people will take it in a political way, some people will take it in an ontological way. A lot of the time you'll see, and I think this is where you've done some writing, people will take AI human interactions and look at that as a new way of being as a human or of relating as a human. But yeah, it's not one fundamental thing. It's just an invitation to center that and think about what it means for how we live. In terms of the second part, what are we saying yes to? I guess I want to rewind and echo Melanie's words a moment ago that resistance is not a monolith, and the different reasons that people have for choosing not to or wishing to choose not to, because as we say, it's not always a choice that can be made in practice, come from tremendously diverse values. You know, the things that we say yes to are all sorts of things. I'm sure if Melanie and I laid our teaching practices side by side, there'd be a lot of things that we'd say, yes, yes, I love doing that. A lot of things that we'd say, I'd never thought of doing that. And a lot of things that we'd say, I'd never do that. Because no two teachers are the same. And I think I would really like to connect with all manner of different people, particularly all manner of people who are making every effort to resist generative AI adoption at the moment, because it is a challenging position to hold, and ask, what would you like to say yes to if you were given that license to say yes? For me, I think it's saying yes to recognizing that it's okay not to be perfect in your outputs, because what you do is something that only you can do. I think that I want education in general to say yes to inclusion as a matter of course, rather than a sort of a standardizing and normalizing. So I think in the preparation for this podcast, we were talking about whether or not I research on assessment, and I don't, but I research on value. And so I have all sorts of things to say about assessment because it's a way of evaluating what education is. That to me is really interesting. I'd like to ask the question, what do we value about learning and the outputs and the processes of learning? That's the question fundamentally. What are we saying yes to?
One of the questions that I have started asking is like, who benefits? Like, is this going to benefit me? Is this going to benefit the student? Or if you're in a corporate environment, is this going to benefit the employer and not the employee? Because oftentimes when you think about that, it becomes a little bit more clear. You know, if you're in a learning situation and it's going to shortcut learning, well, it's not going to benefit you, and that it becomes more obvious. Maybe the initial benefit, because I know a lot of the conversation around AI and education is unfortunately around cheating. But as we know, a student who wants to cheat is going to find a way. And usually students don't want to cheat. It's usually there's these external pressures that are there, like a deadline, and they have things happening in their life that prevents them from meeting that deadline. But a lot of times I talk to people outside of education, and what they're getting shoved down their throats is all this corporate talk around, if you're not using AI, someone who's using it is going to replace you. And I used to actually buy into that. I mean, I've done almost a complete 180 in the past 3 years around my stance on generative AI. So in the early days, I would have actually said that. Now I'm more like, okay, well, but if you're an employee and you're becoming 10x more productive, is your salary going to increase 10x, or all of those benefits just going to flow upward? And when I frame it that way, it's like, oh, you suddenly see these lights turn on. It's like, actually, I didn't think of it that way. So, like, yeah, who's benefiting? In an educational context, it's like, okay, if we're trying to incorporate Gen AI into an LMS, a learning management system, to reduce the time of grading, is that going to benefit the teacher and not the student? So this idea of who benefits has become like a part of that conversation.
It's a great question. And I think what you're hinting at with that sort of 10x, is it a parallel 10x on both sides of the ledger? Is that question not just of who benefits, but in what way does that benefit manifest? You know, is it an efficiency gain, or is it a reduction in the number of people I have to pay to get a thing done? You mentioned before, most students don't want to cheat. Of course, they don't want to cheat. Cheating is a transactional means to an end, and the end is to pass. That's what they want. But we're in a situation at the moment where so much of education, particularly higher education, is all about the having and the output. And so when we come back to assessment, when we conflate the output for success, forgetting that, coming back to the messy first draft, all of those processes of being who you are and putting what you are and what you want into it, ugly and uncomfortable and absolutely priceless. But we can't assess those. We can only assess that beautiful end draft that you submit at the end. That's where cheating becomes extremely attractive.
The conversation about academic integrity it's really fascinating to me. The first time I encountered the phrase post-plagiarism, it sort of lit me on fire because I've always had a non-punitive stance to, I think academic honesty is something that you model in value and think that students are in your class and paying lots of tuition dollars to be in your class to learn how to do that. And that will involve making mistakes. Some of them might strike us as very deliberate or obvious or egregious mistakes, but I've before generative AI, never had a punitive plagiarism policy. It was always a conversation with a student about how they were using and citing sources, using other people's ideas. So I think that generative AI has broken open that world of academic integrity in really interesting ways. And a lot of people's refusal of participation has to do with the surveillance around process. I'm trying to imagine having like a camera over your shoulder when you're drafting a poem or an essay or a short story, and someone saying, well, you really spent a lot of time copying and pasting here, or we checked your Google Docs, log to see if you to catch you doing something wrong. So I try to have a really transparent conversation the very first day of the semester because students are also really weary of being paranoid and being in this world where they feel, I don't use Gen AI and now this teacher has said that I did. And the notorious AI checkers being very bad, Turnitin.com being sort of data scraper that, takes student writing labor and thieves it, no different than the training corpus for large language models, very similar. So I feel like that is a great time to have really honest conversations with our students. And I tell them, everybody is figuring this out right now. And I'm hoping to be your guide with academic integrity. I assume that you already possess integrity and ethics and want to avoid cheating to start from there.
I just want to jump in really quickly and say that I went to Iowa State and to Northern Arizona University because I was interested in corpus collection and corpus linguistics. And you just bringing up that word just reminds me that I sort of want to defend some of us who have created ethical corpora over the years. And I think that's why in the beginning I was so naive about these companies, because that's not how I've ever created a corpus. That's not how I was trained to create a corpus. And then to find out that somebody, it was really like a moment of like, oh my God, I'm so naive, to find that they had scraped the web, taken copyrighted material, and I'm not a machine learning expert in any way. So the human reinforcement learning and all of that stuff didn't occur to me. But yeah, just want to sort of jump in for corpus linguists everywhere who have done that and not, and kept to IRB protocols. And that's kind of just what we've done for years. And so anyway.
I appreciate that because I feel like I was very naive about learning about how LMMs were trained, which is so outside of my field. Like, I don't know anything about that until I started investigating it. And I really thought that the piracy argument, one of the ethical obligations, would hit a lot more people than it did. Everybody in English departments loves writers. They love books. So this idea of, this training corpus being entirely thieved from the working labor of working writers, not sort of phasing many people outside of like the Writers Guild and people who were very actively vocal against it. And of course, the current lawsuits going on, which, it looks like Claude is that they're going to award these payouts to writers. And then when you have images added onto that and the theft of artwork, here I thought, well, this is a community of nerds that has huge fandom. When the whole you could gliblify yourself in your profile picture, I thought, wow, these people love this fandom. And it's creators speaking out, Hayao Miyazaki, that AI was an insult to life itself. That was his quote about it. I thought, well, people who love art will be moved by this argument of the piracy. And increasingly, the answer to that, especially from ed tech folks, was this is back to the inevitability argument. This is just the way they did it. And this is the new normal. And this is the world. And the legal experts will figure it out. It's not a reason not to use the technology, which I find incredulous that that's not a reason, especially from the creative side, that the artists and writers banding together, that would not be a reason enough to say this is unethical tech.
Yeah, Kimberly, you're making me think of that moment in late 2022, when one AI developing company takes its mask off a little bit. It wasn't that GPT 3.5 was the first large language model that had been developed. These things had been in development for about, I believe, since 2016, 2017. By that point, we obviously know that Google had been doing a significant amount of that work, and there were multiple other models. Claude didn't just appear a couple of months later. This work was in train for months and years before the explosion, but the other companies didn't say anything because they knew they had pirated millions of works. It was that moment that these other companies realized people don't seem to care about that. Maybe we can take our masks off too. And I think I really, really feel for that sense of I was duped, because we have been working with companies who have not been transparent about some of these practices. I can't claim to have been upstairs in Microsoft or anything like that, but I've been working in digital learning design and promoting and supporting uptake and integration of educational technologies for over a decade. And so it is this sort of slow discovery of, I wish I had not done this, but I could not have known. It is a difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that naivete. I mean, I've said this multiple times. I mean, first of all, I would have never started a tech company with Kimberly if I had known everything. I mean, in some ways, the naivete serves you because it gives you this sense of courage to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do if you had all of the information. But similarly, it's like after we shut down Moxie, suddenly I had all this time on my hands and I'm like, okay, now I'm doing all of this digging and just getting much more critical and reading for the first time in several years. That's, not reading just research articles, but really learning about how these models were developed. And I also felt duped in a way. And also there was like this shame around it where I was like, remembering in the early days when Kimberly and I were fundraising and talking to investors, I mean, I would say things like solving Bloom's Two Sigma problem. And, we were really all for it, which kind of brings me to one of my next questions, because this is something I'm still struggling with. I'll give a very specific example. So imagine there's a doctoral student where English is their second language, and they normally wouldn't be able there's normally a barrier to creating the types of products that they can now create with generative AI, whether it be a paper, something more formal or less formal. And so you see how it changes their confidence. Like this could be in terms of automated feedback. It could be in terms of like co-creating with generative AI. And so I struggle with like how to support those students, especially when I'm very familiar here in the US with all of the predatory practices that happen in higher ed around recruitment and lack of support. So it's like, I'm curious to know what both of you think around like finding that balance. Like, how do we support students who may already be using it, or even if they're not, when you start to see some of those emotional benefits, like the emotional side of learning that I think doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about the outcomes. How are you thinking about that?
I like to start out by telling students that if they have been using ChatGPT or Claude, or if they are learning how to use it in a different class, in a different context, that I am not there to shame them or to tell them to stop learning it, or if they find it useful in a certain area of writing, but I'm asking them to go on an automation-free journey with me in this class. I do have the great benefit of only teaching face-to-face classes, and I've never taught online. So I do think that is a very different. But with second language learners and with translation software and LMMs, I have this. On one side, I'm thinking about my students in lit class are reading Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World, and it was translated from the Spanish by Lisa Dillman, who's done all of his translations. They have this like writer translator relationship because translation is an art. And she speaks really eloquently about how she approaches his prose. And I feel so much of that is missed when it's outsourced. Now, does that help a second language learner write an academic paper for a grad class? Probably not, but it's still always at the back of my mind, the writer creator side, and that translation itself is a human art, is a construct of another side of writing. So I have no good answer for that other than it's really complicated, and it's very good not to shame people for their uses that they find it useful.
Yeah. My answer really comes back to this vexed concept of literacy. So there's the immediate sort of triage situation. And I have had that situation where I've had a student who was receiving their passes, in some cases failing tasks, and was just really struggling. So I teach design. So a lot of it is about communicating design concepts, the logic of particular design decisions and how they align with theory and the challenge that's before the students. And so obviously everything that we ask our students to do is about communicating in some way. And this student was really struggling to do it. Their first language wasn't English. They had come to Australia quite recently, and ultimately they developed a workflow where they were using a large language model, and I have forgotten which one now. I think it might have been Copilot, but to translate their first draft from their native language, from their native language to English. And that was enabling them to communicate their ideas in a much clearer way, because trying to articulate them in the first place in English, it was coming out garbled. The ideas just weren't sequenced, and details were being left out because it was challenging. And of course, this raises the question of how is this student enrolled in a postgraduate program taught entirely in English, which is its own issue. But, ultimately the student was achieving credits, distinctions. So, those kind of middle to B grade, I suppose, if your grading scales are a little different, but doing a heck of a lot better. But ultimately, as a designer, I would want to see that student able to articulate themselves in a range of different ways. So as a designer, you don't just present things in a written brief. You're also explaining things to team members. You're also presenting things and pitching them. And there are all sorts of different ways that you convey your ideas. The student was a lot stronger in communicating orally, but they did find that a large language model supported them. But ultimately, I want to see them do it without it. That is ultimately the goal. When we come to the problem of literacy, I think that the academy in general has a really undue emphasis on particular forms of English and communication that are not necessarily appropriate to the task that we're actually supporting to learn. And so we're in a kind of a bind ourselves as teachers, where we're trying to support a student to be the best that they can be, but within this narrow range of what literacy can be. And so coming back to that question of what do you want to say yes to, or what kind of education do you want to see going forward, I would really like us to start looking at what are the kinds of literacy that we do want to see from our students, and what kinds of communication with each other and our industries and our practices are most meaningful to who we are as people. Short term, don't shame, scaffold. Long term, we need to change what good looks like.
Yeah, I've been saying for a while that, higher ed here in the US is having a reckoning that's long overdue. I think most people who've been in the academy for a while would admit that, Melanie, you mentioned this in that piece, Burn It Down, about the bloated admin budgets. But the growth of online programs that happened after COVID or during COVID, when universities realized they could admit twice as many students, and they really pushed faculties to the brink of how many students they could manage. I know at one point, I knew of a faculty member in an online doctoral program who went from like 22 students that they were supervising to 40 in a matter of 2 years, did not get a raise. The expectation was that the students, and so I do think that this reckoning that's happening is long overdue, and there's starting to be conversations around sort of going back to in-person learning, which I would be a huge fan of. I mean, personally, I would not be able to continue teaching in my program, but it does feel like there's this reckoning that's happening, and I think it's a good thing. It's is long overdue. But oftentimes the questions that come up put the individual student or the faculty as like, you have to find the solution. The solution is on the individual, when this is obviously a system wide issue, and it can't just be one individual deciding that they're not going to look at test scores in the same way when you have accreditation to think about. And so I think that's why it gets to be so overwhelming as the individual when you feel like you want to resist or you want to do things differently, but yet you're supposed to do things a certain way. You know, you have meetings with your program director, but there are oftentimes other ways. Sometimes it just takes a bit of creativity and like community driven conversations that to spark that creativity around things that are within your control that aren't always obvious because you have your head down and you're trying to get it all done.
I'm very optimistic about the changes of those kinds of innovations. I keep thinking of this phrase like a pedagogy of analog joy, right? And that seems very idealistic for the face-to-face professor. I realize that, but the whole concept of experiential learning, and we say that this is something that we value, seeing things, talking to people, travel, experience-based learning. And in some disciplines, we don't seem to apply the same, like literary studies. I think I've tried to redo my assignments, and I'm calling this gonzo lit crit. Like you go out as an investigative journalist slash anthropologist, and it's entirely subjective, your reaction to a piece of literature, which I've always thought is the way, because I'm a reader response theorist. So I'm like, why are we asking for this disembodied academic voice that nobody really wants to read? Because the things that students write in a literature class should be something that another human being would be interested in reading. So I think there is an opportunity to value those kinds of learning spaces that are purely analog and experiential and touch grass and all of the woo things that we know creative learning can be.
There's something incredibly important about emotion. I think I'm quoting ancient studies when I say that we have found that when parts of people's brains that regulate emotion are damaged, they find it almost impossible to make decisions. The strength of caring about something, about it mattering to you, is what makes us move towards things and take meaningful actions in our worlds. So I love that, Melanie, that own your voice, own what you care about and tell us, because that's what really matters about the work that you do.
And not just that, but there's also this element of the failures and the successes that happen naturally in learning when you allow yourself to have those failures. That emotional sort of exclamation mark that happens during those scenarios are how we sort of encode that expertise. And you can't get to the level of expert. I think it was a Dreyfus article that talked about like how we become experts, and there's the 5 levels, and emotion is like a through line in all of it. And we have to have those failures and those successes in order to really get to the point where things become intuitive and second nature. And I think we're going to see what happens if we try to bypass that to just, taking the shortcuts.
I guess I will do a little stand up and dance for online education here. I teach solely online myself, but I teach in small classes. I have that privilege of working with small cohorts of postgraduate students who are, every single one of them is an adult with a full, complicated, challenging, messy life. And so the amount of time that we have together is incredibly tiny and incredibly precious, because, even the scheduled class times that we have can't always be made by some of these students. They'll have, 4 children or a full-time job, and they're still choosing to study because it's something that matters to them. And so we have to find some way to connect, whether they're in another state or they're easily around the corner from campus. Being able to connect online means we have all of these different options to have a relationship. So I don't know, I just feel incredibly privileged to be able to connect with people who are choosing to do this and who are making an effort to reach me and each other, whether that's by email or, the Zoom chat or the forums on our LMS, which are a great communication channel, or anything else that we can put our hands on to connect. No matter what tools we have available to us, we're constantly trying to do it. And I think, there's something incredibly precious about, I'm doing scare quotes here, touch grass, tech-free moments, but they don't all have to be authentic and to be really, really powerful. I think I'd just like us to have more opportunities to choose.
Well, we are coming up at the end of our hour. So let's kind of finalize this conversation with like a takeaway or some sort of call to action. Like, how can educators and people outside universities even push back ethically and yet still help their students to see a path forward? Kind of coming back to this conversation of like, who is this benefiting? Is there some advice you have for people who want to push back, but who maybe don't know how? Sometimes I say, a lot of times I would love to help people push back, but when it's literally the icon inside Google Docs is a magic wand. What advice do you give people when it's just embedded everywhere?
There are all sorts of little techniques and tricks that you can do. I've learned that there are all sorts of ways of deinstalling Copilot manually on the various apps and things that it's embedded itself into. One of my favorites by one of my former supervisors was the discovery that inserting a swear word of appropriate severity into your Google query would prevent it from generating an AI summary. I've tested that on a number of different swear words now, and I can tell you, go as hard as you can. Swear words are magic. So there are all kinds of little things that you can do like that, and there's wonderful information online.
Wait, can we go back? Can you say can you give us a little bit more direction on that? You're saying that when you're doing a Google search, you put in a swear word somewhere in the middle of the phrase you're searching for?
So if you're trying to figure out how to cork your bathroom, cork my shitty bathroom is not going to do it. It's going to autocorrect it to something that sounds like shit. Bugger's not good enough. It's going to go, oh, did you mean bigger? And give you an AI summary. But if you say cork my fucking bathroom, silence, or cork my bitch of a bathroom, you'll just get your results. So
Instead of that AI summary, you'll get the old school. I can't believe I'm saying this, the old school like list of links to
you'll
websites.
still get the sponsored results. I
Yeah.
don't know how to remove those.
Okay, sorry. That was just too good to pass over. I wanted to be sure we got the exact directions for how to do this.
Tuning into this podcast just for that tip from Miriam. I love it. That's so fun.
Thank you, Colorado. But honestly, for educators and parents, I would say, our time is incredibly limited. Our choices are astoundingly limited. But I think we can choose to say, I'm not using this myself. And if we're not able to enact that choice, we can say, I'd prefer not to, and I would like that choice to be given to me. And we can communicate about that. An example of a technology that I've long found really frustrating, and I know that Melanie does too, but has wonderfully owned her power about, is Turnitin. This is a technology that has essentially been a forced opt-in for students for about a decade. If you want to pass this class, you need to submit your assessments. If you need to submit your assessments, you need to accept the terms and conditions of Turnitin. Melanie, I know, has been not applying that tool, but not every teacher has that power to be able to have that conversation with students saying, I prefer not to be using this. I do not want you to take it seriously because I do not consider it to be important, is just a message to the people around you of your ethical understandings and your ethical values that go with where you have the influence, because we can't control everything, but we can communicate.
In the spirit of that community-based learning that you're talking, like online spaces absolutely can have the same approach of community-based learning. And when reaching people outside of higher ed, I think that's essential that they are tuned in to the conversation as it impacts their children, people in ethics and safety, doing and highlighting a lot of really important things. Sometimes these make it into the news, right? When school AIs and Frank chatbots started saying, the Holocaust wasn't that bad. And people were like, oh, this is a tutor for my sixth grader, because who better to contextualize a complicated historical moment like the Holocaust than a robot. So I think people pay attention when it's something that impacts them and their community. And I think most well-meaning ethical people who have been playing with AI, especially Sora, I think if you give these really stark examples that a lot of feminist voices are starting to say about Sora and its potential for this just intense misogynistic media, that we don't really think of it in that way. Like, oh, I'm uploading a cameo and my teenage daughter downloaded the app and she's allowed her likeness to be in some of these videos. And what are incel hypermasculine culture going to do with that image? Like, that is a legitimate question for parents to have, a legitimate conversation, an important one for them to have. And I think the community outside of higher ed does pay attention to the more the things that break through in the news, from the just strident voices in people asking for guardrails, which is like another unethical reason to resist AI, is the way it was launched, without, as if these things had not been anticipated by a lot of people saying very loudly, this is going to happen if you do this. So I think that we can invite those people into a similar conversation about how they play with the tech in their life and how they model that play with their families, especially young people.
Yeah, I had a very uncomfortable moment with my almost 16-year-old son the other day when I explained to him what Sora 2 is and how dangerous it could be. And he did not want to talk about, robot porn with his mom. But I made him sit and listen to me say, this is very scary and you need to have a heads up, because their teachers aren't talking to them about it. Their teachers are overwhelmed with all the things they have to do. They don't need one more thing on their plate. I think that's my job as a parent. So, yeah, I do. It's very important. Well, we are
No parent wants to have, but
no, I mean, yes, right. I don't think he could look me in the eye. He just like stared down at his feet the whole time, but
Yeah.
um,
I will just throw out one other tip, and that is, I think, the introduction of science fiction as literature. This is how I have the great opportunity to teach a lit survey course called Weird Tales, Classic and Contemporary. So we start with Asimov, Ursula Le Guin, Bradbury, and they've been talking about sentient robots for a long time now. And it's a really fun way to break into the conversation. It's a really fun way to get students reading for pleasure and escapism while also talking about something that's happening. So get people geeked out about science fiction.
great tip. Yeah, I love that.
Love it. I'm a big sci-fi nerd. I love it. Well, I know that we're out of time. We normally have a quick discussion around our pit and our peach. If we don't have time, it's okay. I know, Melanie, you probably have to go.
I can hang out for a little bit.
So we normally like to end every episode just by highlighting our pit and our peach highlight or low light of the week, the month. It doesn't have to be a certain period of time, just as a way to get to know each other on a different level for our listeners. So yeah, if whoever wants to go first, or I can go first to break the ice, I'll just dive in.
you go first. You go first.
I should have brought this up last week because it was fresh and I think it was so traumatic that I blocked it from my mind. But a few weeks ago, I was supposed to do a day trip to Boston to go. I was a keynote to talk about AI with faculty and students at the university I teach at. And I get all the way to the airport. It's like 5 in the morning. And I'm getting my purse out of the vehicle and my wallet. I don't have my wallet. And I've never done that before. So I couldn't make my flight. I had totally missed my flight. So I could not go to the keynote in person. I ended up having to do it. It was fine. I did it over Zoom, but I was so mortified. And I remember the whole way driving home, I was like, well, what am I going to say? I can't just say that I left my wallet at home. That's so irresponsible. And this is my boss. It's the dean who I work for. This isn't just some person who hired me as the keynote. I was like, I can't admit that. So I remember coming home and I was talking to Anthony, my partner, and he's like, just tell the truth. You can't lie about it. It's going to look bad, but you don't want to have to keep up with a lie. I was like, you're right. So I did. I just said, I'm so embarrassed to say that I left my wallet at home this morning and I was unable to board my flight because I obviously didn't have my license with me. And it was fine. So that's also my peach. It was like a reminder to me of just like, be truthful, even if you're an idiot and you make a big mistake. Yeah, so it just made me feel better about it. I wasn't dishonest about what happened and everything ended up working out. We ended up having the sessions over Zoom and it ended up going really well. But I feel like I blacked out that whole morning because I was just mortified. I was like, I'm finally getting paid to do a keynote, which is what I've been wanting for years. I've been doing free stuff. And of course, I don't make it. Yeah.
A lesson from the universe about how we are powerless over everything. Well, my peach is just being here with all of you. I mean, this is like a dream to be able to talk to women in an honest, open space about things that you care about. And yeah, I've been very, very excited about this chat because it feels like coming home to, after 2 years of trying to start a bit, grow a business, just the intensity, the workaholism. It feels like if the podcast was the only thing that we kept out of that whole debacle, and the learning, we learned a lot. I learned a lot. Then it was worth it. And I can't believe that this conversation has ended up being about, is I've been saying to people lately, like there's a yes in every no. Whenever you say no, there is going to be some sort of a yes. There's something you're saying you're opening to when you shut down something else. And I've just been kind of telling myself that as a mantra because I say yes to everything all the time. I get so excited and I say yes and whatever. And I think, and I do think as a young woman, I was told like, you can do anything, you can have it all. You can be a mom and have a career and true, but that disallowed me from seeing the things that I was giving up or from facing like, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard. And you're going to have to make some really hard decisions and compromise and whatever. So I love that this conversation developed into like, there's a yes in every no, and look at what you're valuing and look at who's benefiting. Yeah. So I'm just very, very grateful to have had this conversation. I don't know if there was a pit in there, but that was my peach.
I think it's that the peach is around the pit. I think this is the theme, isn't it? Because you've really planted that and given us the opportunity to focus on what we do care about and what lights us up. I mean, I'd love to do another conversation about just completely geeking out on sci-fi. But, I was going to say that a conversation I had this morning with a really good friend was probably a peach around a pit, because the conversation began with absolute frustration and anger and fear. And we were talking about higher education at the moment and the employment market and various changes that are happening in the sector in Australia. And we began with this sense of, I don't know, I just need someone to cry with. And we ended the conversation in a kind of a shared commitment to work together to speculate on what we really wanted to see in the world. And I think that what you've done in this conversation is just that in a nutshell. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, I echo all of that because connecting with people and having these, I was thinking in my mind during my commute over the last few days of seeing the questions and thinking of things that I wanted to say to you all because I was so excited to talk about this and to be invited on a forum that has a pretty big audience, a platform of people that want to hear specifically women and voices talking about all of these issues in a way that's generous and collegial and also can get at some really thorny, difficult subjects. So the ability to connect both in my resistance space and social media space, but on this podcast with all of you has been really wonderful. We should do a sci-fi episode.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to tie this up by just saying how well this fits into this sort of period of life that I'm in. And I recently wrote a Substack about it called Reclaiming the Relational, where I've really been focused on sort of shelving this productivity, efficiency, optimization part of my life that I was in for a and really just honing in on the community and the relationships and the people. And I just feel very grateful that I get to do this and have these conversations with people like you. So
So much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, y'all.
thanks. Bye. So Kimberly and I are doing a debrief. We just spoke with Melanie and Miriam, and it was our first time having two guests, and we didn't have enough time. There's a lot that we wanted to get to, so we thought we'd have a quick debrief to talk about some of the things we didn't get a chance to touch on. In the beginning of the episode, when we introduced Melanie and Miriam, we talked about how they both co-authored this open letter from educators to refuse the call to adopt generative AI in education. So I wanted to touch on that and just read out sort of the 8 things that they pledged to do, which has now gotten, I'm on the website now, 1,084 signatures from educators all over the world. And here are the 8 things. So it starts out by saying, we do not support the use of generative AI in education. We pledge to uphold the following commitments in our work. Number 1, we will not use generative AI to mark or provide feedback on student work, nor design any part of our courses. Number 2, we will not promote institutional Gen AI products built on unethically developed foundation models like ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot. We will not accept without evidence the sales agenda of people who are not educators, nor will we spread hype at the expense of student learning and vibrant pedagogy. Number 4, we will not train our students to use generative AI tools to replace their own intellectual effort and development. Number 5, we will not ask students or staff to violate the spirit of academic integrity by promoting the use of unethical products. Number 6, we will not rewrite curriculum to insert generative AI into it for the purposes of scaffolding AI literacy. Number 7, we will not contribute to the erosion of academic freedom and educator agency by forcing educators into compliance with technology they find unethical. Number 8, we honor students' rights to resist and refuse as well. Did any of those stand out to you, Kimberly? There are 2 that stood out to me. One is around not using it to provide feedback. And the other was, we will not accept without evidence the sales agenda of people who are not educators. And the latter one really stood out to me because that was something we talked about a lot when we were building Moxie, is like, hey, we are educators. You can trust us. We don't have the agenda of, someone working with these frontier models who don't have a clue about education. And that was one of the things we learned a lot about. We didn't realize there was this big tension in higher ed with ed tech. We didn't know it until we were in it. But I say even then, we are educators, but we were so naive. I think that was like one of the big lessons we learned, is because we were non-technical, which I think was a good thing, but ultimately we really lacked a fundamental understanding of like how these frontier models were being developed, all of these ethical concerns around data annotation and training the models and copyright. We were pretty clueless to it. Thoughts?
Yeah, there was a LinkedIn post recently that was from someone who said, in my department, we have now banned the banning of generative AI. And I just was like, I can't let this go. I have to say something. So I reposted it and I just said, as a discourse analyst, the banning is still banning. Like, circular logic here. People are actually doing that now. They're saying things like, you cannot ban generative AI in your classroom. Departments, colleges, and that seems totally opposite to academic freedom, first of all, but just it's I don't know, everything right now, everything feels so binary. So like, it's either yes or it's no, and there's no gray in the middle, and you're either for us or you're against us. And I do not like that polarized discourse, which I think social media has contributed to, and it's siloed us and all of these things. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about when you were reading that. It's just like, there's room to disagree.
There is room to disagree. Sometimes I think about this, though. I wonder if this were happening at a different moment in time, if we would have more bandwidth to handle it. It just feels interesting that it's like at the time where we are having like serious political turmoil in the US, where we are incredibly polarized. I obviously know that things have happened and history repeats itself, but since I've been alive, it's extreme, and that's the only experience I have to go on. And it just feels like the bandwidth of people to handle all of this on top of everything else that's going on with the wars that are happening in Russia and Ukraine and Gaza and Israel. There's so much that's going on. And sometimes I just think about like, if this were happening at a different point in time, would we have more capacity to tolerate the gray? Obviously, we don't, so we don't know. But
something else we didn't get to ask them that was kind of in our prep sheet was about the idea of kind of a customer service model of higher ed. And one of the things when Moxie was open and we were running it, I noticed a pattern in the discourse. One time I posted something in a Facebook group, and maybe it was a webinar, and someone commented, "This, by the way, is a for-profit company doing XYZ." And so there is a disconnect, I think, among faculty from the business model of a university, where they don't see or associate themselves with capitalism or with business in general, or for profit, not for profit, whatever, however keywords you want to associate with it. They want to do this us versus them thing, when actually universities are business. They are running like a business now more than ever. They get money. We used to call it at the community college like butts in seats. So I think there's a real disconnect among faculty members, to understand like what's going on and what their decision makers, what their bosses, their supervisors are having to face from legislatures who are withholding funds because of certain philosophical beliefs, or and you can say more about that, but we did not get to talk about the customer service model.
There's a lot of this to unpack. I mean, in our conversation with Melanie and Miriam, we talked about naivete. And it reminds me when I started my first consulting business, I had been in the academy for maybe 6 years, and I thought I was going to go on this like traditional tenure track path. And then I left and I started my consulting business for personal reasons at the time. And I was very naive. I only related it to my experience, and I had a really great educational experience. I had a really involved mentor. I never saw the business model there. Like, I genuinely was like, this is all about learning. I had great mentorship. My faculty were super involved. I didn't even know that there was an industry where you could hire a consultant to help with your research. And then I found out that it was there, and I was like, I'm perfectly positioned to do this, and this will give me some flexibility so I can take care of my dad. And then I saw like the really ugly underbelly of parts of higher ed. Obviously, I don't want to generalize. It's not all like this, but the business model is. I mean, they all have to find a way to pay the bills. There's operational costs. And then as Melanie mentioned in her essay, Burn It Down, like there are very fat admin budgets. Like, do we need all of these layers of management and oversight for the machine to continue running? And most would say no, like that's a big problem. I mean, I also talked in the episode about how I knew that faculty member who's essentially her class size doubled during COVID because the university figured out that they could tap into this opportunity and bring in a lot more students and have all those tuition dollars, but her pay did not reflect that. It was all going somewhere, but not to her. And that is the reality of higher ed. But anyways, whenever I first started my consulting business and I started learning about predatory practices, and I remember being approached by this one university in Chicago, I found out that they were paying recruiters like basically 40% of the tuition money that students, if they could get in the student, the recruiter or the company of recruiters would get like 40% of that tuition. That was their pay, the incentive to get the student in. And as long as that student was paying tuition, 40% of it was going out the door to the recruiters. They had an open enrollment policy. They had policies in place that basically kept students in the proposal stage as long as possible without much support.
So these are graduates.
Yes, doctoral program. And they wanted to refer students to us to get support specifically for students who were not passing their comp exams. And the institution would charge thousands of dollars every time the student would retake a comp. And they wanted us to help these like students who just couldn't get through the comps. They could take it as many times as possible, as needed. But then they wanted a portion of the money we made on the students. So they were like, if we refer 50 students to you and half of them hire you and pay you thousands of dollars to pass the comps, while they're also paying the university thousands of dollars to retake the comps, we want 20% of that revenue. And I said, so you want to profit on their failure? Like, is that what I'm hearing? I didn't get the contract. I didn't want it. I said, I'm not going to do a revenue share. I'll support the students, but I'm not doing, this is so unethical. And then I realized how common that is. Like, if I'm not going to do it, they're just going to find someone who will.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the sorts of like really interesting scenarios where I think about how students might be using generative AI. Because if the students who are stuck in that really ugly cycle of paying thousands of dollars for comps, they don't have any institutional support, the writing center isn't made for them, what if they use generative AI and now their writing is superb and they pass the comps? Like, that is a very fuzzy area because I'm like, you're trapped in a very unethical situation to begin with. And by all means, like, I think you should be able to use it, especially if the writing itself is a sticking point when you were admitted into a program that knew you weren't prepared and refuses to give you the supports to prepare you.
Mm-hmm.
And those were kind of the sorts of nitty gritty conversations I wanted to get into and we just didn't have time for. And I think Melody sort of hinted at it, like there's no judgment that someone's using it. They don't come at it from a place of judgment. But those are very real situations that students are currently in and faculty are currently in. And I've had so many people approach me over the years because of our work in AI saying like, I've been accused. What do I didn't use it or I did use it and now I'm afraid to admit that I did, but it's still my work. It's still my ideas. And it's hard. There's no playbook.
No, there's not.
Mm-mm.
I did wished that I could have followed up on something Miriam said about, as a designer, all the different ways that she presents. And I think what I heard her saying, I would love to clarify, is like she's presenting it orally and visually and in writing. And so she's able to kind of get at it from a lot of different modes. And that's one of the things that I used to tell people, because the number one question we would get is it ethical to use it at all? And how do I get around if someone, accuses me of this? And what I would often say is, well, could you orally defend it? If someone said to you, I don't believe that this is your writing, if you understand it well enough and you can explain it orally, then even if you used a machine, I think that it's never super clear. There's always some gray area, but like, I think if you feel confident. And actually, these were often people who do not speak English as their first language. And so they were asking me, kind of as a linguist and with a background in teaching English as a second or foreign language. And I think that if you can do that in orally and not in written form, then you're stuck, because assessment is all around the written final product, which we did talk about. Only at the doctoral level, at the final assessment of your thesis or dissertation, are you asked to orally defend it. I think that's what she was hinting at. But I think if educators do not have that time to commit to a classroom of 40, 25 even students, if I had been able to let my freshman composition students or my business communication students stand up and defend maybe what they couldn't write about, but they could talk about, then I would have a much more whole picture of their ability to communicate whatever we were doing in class. But we don't have that time. And I also want to say, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch how this changes as fewer and fewer international students are allowed to come and study in the U.S. because they are cash cows. They pay out of state tuition. And there aren't there aren't that many of them, maybe, but they're paying 3 to 4 times what an in-state student is paying. So they're subsidizing all kinds of things. When we see that go away, not only do we lose their intellectual capital, but we lose the money that they are contributing to the system itself.
Yeah, there are a lot of concerns there. There's just concerns all around. But again, we touched on this in the conversation. I do feel like this reckoning was overdue. And I hope that some good will come of it. I think a lot of these programs that have popped up over the past decade are just unnecessary. And we are starting to see this sort of pivot more toward technical. And we need that. Like, we need more technical people to do the work that makes the world go round. I think community colleges are incredible, and we need to be encouraging students to take advantage of those. We don't need a doctoral degree or an advanced degree for every possible thing. Like, do you really need, every single person in an organization to have a terminal degree? I mean, it's part of the reason we have this huge student debt issue. So I feel like as universities are grappling with this, but there's still the core issue of like the motivations are very different. If you're a program director or a dean, you are looking at this problem very differently than the individual faculty member and then the student themselves. And for students who are already in the midst of a program when this started happening, who are already in a lot of debt, I mean, they want to finish. They need something to show for all of this time and money and energy and effort. And they're facing this economy that is telling them, learn AI, or the next person who knows how to use it will replace you. And that's scary, especially if they're not getting it. But I think something that we didn't touch on that I meant to was this idea of like the contextual differences and how like AI resistance, AI is such an umbrella term. And there's so much more to it than just like going to chat GPT. Like in the healthcare space, when we talk about AI, it's like there's what you might be using in a classroom scenario, like an LLM to help with writing. But then it's a whole other conversation when you think of like, now you're going to go into a healthcare environment where I use this example of an AI ambient listening system that could be in a hospital setting where it's recording virtual scripts and notes, or it's monitoring patient safety. Those are examples of the AI that we don't really talk about in a lot of these conversations. And I know that Melanie mentioned this in her essay, so I'm just going to go ahead and kind of say it for her. Like when Melanie has been talking about AI resistance, it's in the context of like the educational setting. Like she's very supportive of the potential for AI to improve medicine and healthcare. Like I think we could all agree that like AlphaFold by DeepMind is an example of this. It looks at protein folding and it can solve really complex medical problems. And there's a lot of potential there. So I don't want people to hear this and think that it's just like AI, not at all, like resisting every form of it for any reason. There are really promising applications of it. It's just Melanie and Miriam are really looking at it from like its role in a classroom setting.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask Miriam about her idea that care doesn't scale and the connection with that to feedback and like affective learning issues. But alas, there was no time. They were great though. And it was such a, the conversation felt very feminine and very like caring and gentle. Yet it was powerful. And I think one of the things that I love about this podcast is that we can amplify the voices of women in a space that's dominated by men. And you and I used to talk about this a lot in terms of how Moxie was going to be funded, because we really did not want to go out to have investors, but that's the only way tech companies are funded right now. You can't run a tech company without getting outside investors. And that was one of the most fascinating things I learned in running Moxies, that they are subsidized by these very wealthy individuals. And that nobody is actually paying what the value of it is, that the company would be bleeding money if not for this injection of capital from really wealthy individuals. And we didn't know how to source it otherwise.
Yeah,
So,
unless
yeah.
you're Elon Musk and you are a billionaire, you have to rely on investors. And I think that was kind of what you were hinting at when you talked about that comment, is like they're for profit. It's like, yeah, you need investors, and an investor doesn't want to throw their money into a nonprofit company. Like the whole premise is that you're going to make a lot of money and you're going to, 10x, 20x, whatever their investment was. That's kind of what you have to do it. If we could have continued going without investors, we would have. But just the little roadmap that we had to get us through the next 2 years was over $3 million. I've never seen $3 million in my life. And so there was no world where we built a product that was going to continue competing with what was on the market and delivering value without that sort of investment. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a tech company that is successful that doesn't have outside investment. And that's unfortunately just the world we live in. And you and I joked toward the end. I mean, we're very serious, but I think we said it jokingly because we just didn't see how it was feasible. It was like, how can we build a more matriarchal
Yes.
company that doesn't run in this way? And we never can figure it out. And so,
Yeah.
here we
Well,
are.
you can't figure it out when you're under duress to pay bills and there's not enough money coming in to do that.
Is there anything else that you feel like we didn't get to that you wish we would have? I mean, I do think at some point we're just going to have them back.
Yeah. Well, I want to read some of that science fiction before we have them back because even though I was an English major, we didn't read science fiction. So I would love to. Actually, I was thinking I'm gonna message Melanie on LinkedIn and say, hey, give me a reading list of cool sci-fi. And so maybe we could do that. You and I have also talked about having a book club.
Yes. Oh, the book club. Let's bring that up. So
Mhm.
if you're listening to this and you're interested in a book club, leave a comment. Kimberly and I have started reading a lot of the same books, and we have been talking about them. And I think that the sort of conversations that we're having around what we're reading might be of interest to others, and other people might be interested in reading these same books. I don't really know how to structure a book club around. I mean, some of the books that we've read are so long, it would take longer than I think a month for most
Oh,
people.
Lord.
And like Surveillance Capitalism,
Surveillance capitalism is a tome.
like 600 pages. Um, yeah, we've been thinking about having a book club around just sort of piggybacking on what we're already doing in our time offline.
Yeah. All right. Well, lots of fun stuff to come. But right now, Jessica, we need to go finish a research project that we started months ago. We got to get that done
We need to
and out the door
extracts.
because I do. It's a corpus. It's a corpus project. We harvested our corpus very ethically from open source research articles. And it does center around the use of generative AI in scientific or academic research writing. So we're going to do that and hopefully be able to share the results.
Yeah, and we haven't not finished because it's not interesting.
Oh no, we just got waylaid.
Well, yeah, I mean, we started it in the midst of, I think Moxie was winding down,
Uh-huh.
and then Moxie wound down, and then we were so burnt out, we just
Uh,
needed a minute to recover, but we're back. We're back.
and we do have co-researchers that have kept going in our absence and gotten it accepted at a couple of different conferences, even preceding, final results. So, yeah. All right. Well, that was really fun.
Yeah, that was fun.
All right.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Women Talkin Bout AI. If you enjoyed this conversation, please be sure to follow the show, leave us a review, and share this episode. It really helps more people find us. Until next time.